A city breathing the promise of glamour, golden dreams flickering on studio backlots, and neon signs that never sleep. Hollywood was more than a place, it was an idea, a sanctuary for those who dared to dream beyond the gray, post-war haze that blanketed the rest of the country. But beneath the sheen of movie premieres and convertible Cadillacs, something far darker festered. You see, for every rags to riches fairy tale, there were 10 stories that never made the screen, tales swallowed by the city's long, blood-stained shadows. In the weeks after New Year's Eve, Los Angeles was in a strange, suspended mood. The air was crisp, but not cold. The city was waking from a long hangover of war and celebration. Soldiers had come home, but not all returned to parades. The city's underbelly was restless. The boulevards glistened with the footprints of dreamers, drifters, and drunks. And in the alleyways, another kind of dream flourished, one lined with desperation and the scent of danger. On the morning of January 15th, something stopped Los Angeles in its tracks. In a vacant lot in Leimert Park, just south of downtown, a housewife named Betty Bersinger was pushing her stroller down Norton Avenue. The sun hadn't risen fully yet, and the lot beside her looked like any other stretch of open earth, until she saw it. At first, she thought it was a discarded mannequin, pale, rigid, split in half at the waist, its arms stretched above its head. A grim joke maybe, or a studio prop dumped in the wrong place. But as she inched closer, the horror crystallized. This wasn't a mannequin, it was a woman, severed cleanly in two, drained entirely of blood, and posed in a theatrical, almost mocking way. The body was so pristine, so deliberate, it didn't look real. Police arrived within minutes. The press followed. Soon, the lot was crowded with men in trench coats and flashing bulbs. Even the most hardened detectives struggled to maintain composure. This wasn't just a murder. It was a performance, a message. Her face had been slashed from the corners of her mouth to her ears, a grotesque approximation of a smile. Her body bore precise incisions. Whoever had done this wasn't just a killer, they were calculated, cold, and disturbingly calm, and they had vanished. Within hours, the woman was identified. She had been seen before, in cafes, at parties, walking the streets of Hollywood dressed in black, with a flower tucked in her dark hair. She was familiar, but not known. The newspapers would call her the Black Dahlia. But to the LAPD, she was now the center of the most gruesome murder they'd ever seen. Before she was the Black Dahlia, she was just Elizabeth. To most people, she was a stranger, a ghost in photographs, a name in headlines, a mystery to unravel. But before all of that, she was a daughter, a dreamer, a young woman trying to find her place in a world that rarely made space for the delicate. Elizabeth Short was born in Hyde Park, Massachusetts, on July 29, 1924. One of 5 daughters, she grew up in the working-class town of Medford, just outside Boston. Her childhood was marked by instability, but not yet tragedy. That would come later. Her father, Cleo Short, was a miniature golf course designer until the Great Depression wiped out both his business and, seemingly, his will to endure. In 1930, he disappeared, leaving his car abandoned on a bridge. Authorities assumed he had taken his own life. For years, Elizabeth and her mother Phoebe believed he was dead. That grief settled into the fabric of their lives. But he wasn't dead. He was in California, very much alive, having abandoned his family without a word. That betrayal would haunt Elizabeth for years. When she eventually made contact with him as a teenager, he offered her a lifeline out west. She took it, but it wouldn't last. She arrived in California with the hopes so many carried, to start over, to become someone, to leave the gray skies of New England for the golden light of the Pacific. She was 19, bright-eyed and full of illusions. But the reunion with her father was short-lived, strained, and eventually broken beyond repair. From there, Elizabeth drifted. She worked as a waitress, sometimes a hostess, living in rented rooms and friends' apartments. She often relied on the generosity or manipulation of men. She was never rooted, never stable. Her beauty was striking, dark hair, porcelain skin, and a quiet vulnerability that seemed to draw people in and keep them at a distance all at once. She dressed with flair, always in black, often with a flower behind one ear. Friends and acquaintances remembered her as soft-spoken, somewhat shy, and constantly in search of something just out of reach. She told stories of suitors, of engagements, even of a fiancé who had died in the war. Some of those stories were true, others weren't, but maybe she believed them or needed to believe them. She moved between cities: Santa Barbara, San Diego, Hollywood, never settling for long. In 1943, she was arrested in Santa Barbara for underage drinking. Her mugshot from that night, dark curls, an ambiguous smile, would later become one of the most reproduced images in true crime history. It was eerie how iconic that photo would become, a moment frozen, long before anyone knew how she'd be remembered. People saw her round town, at drugstores, at diners, in nightclubs, always near but never really part of the Hollywood elite. She had a presence, even if she was anonymous, and that anonymity paired with her beauty created stories in people's minds. Everyone seemed to have a memory of her after her death, some real, some invented, as if she was never quite real to begin with. Elizabeth wasn't a starlet, though she longed to be one. She didn't have credits to her name, but she carried herself like someone born for the screen, a tragic figure in search of a script, and Hollywood was always ready to write one. In the days leading up to her death, Elizabeth was said to be staying at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown LA. That was the last confirmed sighting. She left the lobby, turned a corner into the January night, and was never seen alive again. No one knows exactly what happened between the hotel and the vacant lot. There's a gap in time, a blank space that's never been filled, a darkness that swallowed her whole. And when she reemerged, she was no longer Elizabeth Short. She was a headline. The newspapers named her after a 1946 noir film playing in theaters at the time, The Blue Dahlia, because of her black clothing, her haunting beauty, her aura of mystery. They dubbed her the Black Dahlia, a name designed to sell papers, a name that would bury the real woman beneath an archetype. They called her promiscuous, a drifter, a seductress, but there was no evidence to support those labels, just projections, gossip, and the feverish desire to make her death make sense. As if her lifestyle had invited such brutality, as if the murder could be explained away by who they thought she was. But Elizabeth Short wasn't a villain. She wasn't even a mystery, not really. She was just a girl, lost in a city built on illusion. She had a family, she had flaws, she wanted to be seen, to be loved, to be safe, and instead, she became something else entirely, an unsolvable puzzle with a smile carved into her face. Narrator calmly, her story had already ended. But for Los Angeles, it had only just begun. Next, we go back to January 15th, to the lot, to the moment a city would lose its innocence. But the reality remained. Someone had tortured her, murdered her, and left her like a discarded doll in a city that traded dreams for drama. The autopsy report read like a medical journal scribbled by a surgeon possessed. Elizabeth had died of hemorrhaging from the lacerations on her face and blows to the head. The cuts to her mouth had been made while she was still alive, that grotesque smile carved slowly, deliberately. The body had been washed, likely in a bathtub, and then mutilated with exacting care. There were signs of postmortem mutilation and a chilling absence of hesitation. No fingerprints at the scene, no murder weapon, no tire tracks or blood in the soil. The killer had not just vanished, they had erased themselves. It was as if the crime had taken place in a surgical theater, not the city streets. And yet, someone knew. Someone had done this and had taken the time to stage the scene. Like an artist unveiling their darkest work, this wasn't just murder, it was performance. Then came the first letter. 3 days after the body was found, the Los Angeles Examiner received a message. It was a cut-and-paste note assembled from newspaper clippings. It read, "Here's Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." Inside the envelope were Elizabeth's birth certificate, business cards, photographs, and an address book, all cleaned with gasoline. Just like the body, no fingerprints, no smudges, no mistakes. The killer was watching, taunting. The letter was signed, the Black Dahlia Avenger. The police had seen this kind of thing before, but not in Los Angeles. Not with this level of boldness. This was the kind of case that inspired nightmares. where leads multiplied like shadows but never solidified. Detectives would later admit the killer was always one step ahead. Over the next week, more letters arrived, each one more mocking than the last. One claimed, "I will give up in Dahlia killing if I get 10 years. Don't try to find me." But there was no trail. The killer used rubber gloves, burned his clothes, cleaned the body. Even modern forensic analysis would be challenged by the surgical precision with which evidence was erased. The press dubbed it the case that ate the LAPD. Dozens of detectives were assigned, but the investigation was chaotic. Over 150 suspects were questioned. More than 60 people confessed, each one more implausible than the last. Some were mentally ill, others were just seeking fame. Some simply wanted to be part of the story, to belong to the myth of the Black Dahlia. The media fed the frenzy. Headlines turned Elizabeth from a human being into a femme fatale caricature. Rumors painted her as a prostitute, a lesbian, a serial heartbreaker. None of it was proven. All of it was consumed. And somewhere, hidden behind the fog of exaggeration and gossip, the real killer sat, silent, unseen. For the police, time was slipping away. The longer the case dragged on, the colder it became. Tips dried up, witnesses changed stories, suspects disappeared, and the public, they moved on. Other headlines, other horrors. But that vacant lot on Norton Avenue would never be the same. Some say the grass never grew back right, that the ground still carries the echo of that morning. A kind of urban haunting, not of a ghost, but of a question that has never been answered. A question that echoes louder with every passing year. Who hated her enough to do this? Whoever they were, they didn't just kill Elizabeth Short. They made her eternal. The narrative of the Black Dahlia wasn't shaped by facts. It was written by headlines, born in a newsroom rather than a morgue. The press wanted a story that sold, not the truth of a scared, struggling woman who moved from couch to couch in borrowed clothes. So instead, they crafted an image, the vamp, the seductress, the girl who danced too close to the fire. But beneath the noise, the investigation was collapsing. Evidence was thin. There were no fingerprints on the belongings sent to the examiner. No usable prints at the crime scene. Witnesses were unreliable, either too eager to be involved or too afraid to tell the truth. The detectives assigned to the case worked tirelessly, but they were fighting uphill against a storm of false leads, public frenzy, and political interference. And then came the letters. More taunting notes arrived, each cut from magazine pages, riddled with cryptic phrases and mocking tones. The killer seemed to enjoy the spotlight, or at least the illusion of control. In one letter, he hinted at surrender. In another, he listed names he claimed would lead to more victims. None of them checked out. It was like chasing a ghost that laughed at every turn. Detectives scoured every inch of Elizabeth's last known whereabouts: the Biltmore Hotel, the Greyhound Station, the bars and apartments she'd visited in the days before her death. They traced every phone call, every letter, every cab ride. But her final hours remained a void. And then came the rumors of corruption, of covered dash-ups. Some began to suspect the LAPD didn't want the case solved, or at least, not if it meant exposing someone important. Hollywood had deep connections with the police. Powerful men, rich club owners, former silent film stars, they had influence. And if Elizabeth had crossed one of them, the truth might never come to light. Among the mountain of tips was something truly chilling. An anonymous call led police to a downtown locker. Inside was a handbag and a shoe, both believed to belong to Elizabeth. Like the other belongings, they had been wiped clean. No blood, no fingerprints, just silence. The press gave the killer a name, the Black Dahlia Avenger, and it stuck. Soon, the public was playing detective. Amateur sleuths mailed in theories. Psychics offered visions. One man turned himself in, claiming the ghost of Elizabeth was haunting him. Another said her spirit had possessed his dog. It would have been laughable if it weren't so horrifying. The deeper the LAPD went, the less they found. The case file grew to over 3,000 pages, but no one was arrested. No one even came close. Investigators grew bitter. The leads ran dry, and still, the killer was watching. Many believed he read the papers daily, following his story like a serialized novel. Maybe he even walked by the crime scene, smiling at the chalk outlines that had long since faded. One detective later said, "This wasn't a man who wanted to be caught. This was someone who had done this before, or would do it again." And just when the investigation seemed to be gasping its final breath, a name emerged from the fog. Dr. George Hodel. But that's a story for another part. For now, the trail remained cold, the truth buried beneath the weight of falsehoods and whispers. Every clue felt like a performance, and the killer? He was the director. Watching from the dark for months, the case files thickened. Every page led nowhere, every tip turned to smoke. But then came the names. Some whispered, some shouted. Some stood out like neon in the Los Angeles night. One in particular would redefine the investigation, and decades later, divide the true crime world. George Hodel, doctor, artist, socialite, monster. Hodel was no ordinary suspect. He was brilliant, wealthy, and disturbingly connected. A trained surgeon who studied at Caltech and the University of California. A lover of surrealist art. An eccentric who hosted wild parties in his Spanish-style mansion in Hollywood's Franklin Hills. A house filled with artists, writers, prostitutes, and secrets. By 1950, he was already under LAPD surveillance, not for the Black Dahlia murder specifically, but for something perhaps even more disturbing. That year, the LAPD, convinced Hodel might be involved in multiple crimes, planted listening devices in his home, 18 microphones hidden behind the walls of 5121 Franklin Avenue. What they captured was shocking. One of the recordings includes Hodel saying, "Suppose and I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary because she's dead." His secretary, by the way, was dead. She had overdosed under suspicious circumstances not long before the bugs were installed. The tapes also picked up screaming, possibly from a woman. There were sounds of what may have been digging, and more chilling, the soft, unmistakable clink of surgical instruments being cleaned. But despite these recordings, Hodel was never arrested, never charged. The surveillance was stopped, the evidence sealed away. Decades later, it would be his own son, Steve Hodel, a former LAPD homicide detective, who would accuse him. Steve spent years investigating his father. He pored through archives, crime scene photos, police reports. He compared his father's handwriting to the Black Dahlia Avenger letters. He mapped locations tied to his father's movements. He even discovered that two witnesses had identified George Hodel as someone Elizabeth Short had known, possibly feared. Steve Hodel published books, Black Dahlia Avenger, Most Evil, laying out his case in chilling detail. To some, his work is damning. To others, it's circumstantial. But George Hodel wasn't the only suspect. There was Mark Hansen, a nightclub owner in Hollywood who had known Elizabeth. She had reportedly stayed at his home briefly. Some sources say she rejected his advances. He had connections, influence, and access to the kind of people who didn't mind getting their hands dirty. But nothing ever tied him directly to the crime. Then there was Leslie Dillon, a bellhop and aspiring writer obsessed with sadism and sexual violence. He contacted police claiming to have theories about the Dahlia murder. But as he spoke more, it became clear he knew details that hadn't been made public. For months, the case files thickened. Every page led nowhere. Every tip turned to smoke. But then came the names. Some whispered, some shouted. Some stood out like neon in the Los Angeles night. One in particular would redefine the investigation, and decades later, divide the true crime world. George Hodel. Hodel was no ordinary suspect. He was brilliant, wealthy, and disturbingly connected. A trained surgeon who studied at Caltech and the University of California. A lover of surrealist art. An eccentric who hosted wild parties in his Spanish-style mansion in Hollywood's Franklin Hills. A house filled with artists, writers, prostitutes, and secrets. By 1950, he was already under LAPD surveillance, not for the Black Dahlia murder specifically, but for something perhaps even more disturbing. That year, the LAPD, convinced Hodel might be involved in multiple crimes, planted listening devices in his home. 18 microphones hidden behind the walls of 5121 Franklin Avenue. What they captured was shocking. One of the recordings includes Hodel saying, "Suppos and I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary because she's dead." His secretary, by the way, was dead. She had overdosed under suspicious circumstances not long before the bugs were installed. The tapes also picked up screaming, possibly from a woman. There were sounds of what may have been digging, and more chilling, the soft, unmistakable clink of surgical instruments being cleaned. But despite these recordings, Hodel was never arrested, never charged. The surveillance was stopped, the evidence sealed away. Decades later, it would be his own son, Steve Hodel, a former LAPD homicide detective, who would accuse him. Steve spent years investigating his father. He pored through archives, crime scene photos, police reports. He compared his father's handwriting to the Black Dahlia Avenger letters. He mapped locations tied to his father's movements. He even discovered that two witnesses had identified George Hodel as someone Elizabeth Short had known, possibly feared. Steve Hodel published books, Black Dahlia Avenger, Most Evil, laying out his case in chilling detail. To some, his work is damning. To others, it's circumstantial. But George Hodel wasn't the only suspect. There was Mark Hansen, a nightclub owner in Hollywood who had known Elizabeth. She had reportedly stayed at his home briefly. Some sources say she rejected his advances. He had connections, influence, and access to the kind of people who didn't mind getting their hands dirty. But nothing ever tied him directly to the crime. Then there was Leslie Dillon, a bellhop and aspiring writer obsessed with sadism and sexual violence. He contacted police claiming to have theories about the Dahlia murder. But as he spoke more, it became clear he knew details that hadn't been made public. He mentioned a friend who might have committed the murder. That friend, a mortician. When police pushed harder, Dillon panicked and fled. He was arrested and held incommunicado for days, illegally, before the LAPD quietly let him go. Some believe Dillon was involved. Others believe he was a mentally disturbed man who got too close to the case for comfort. There was Walter Bailey, a respected surgeon whose house was mere blocks from where Elizabeth's body was found. He had the medical skill to bisect a body cleanly. His estranged daughter even theorized he committed the crime as a twisted form of revenge for personal betrayals. But again, no proof. And then there were the ghosts. Anonymous men who may have picked her up on the corner. Roommates who lied about their whereabouts. Drifters who vanished after the murder. Theories sprang up about mob hits, secret abortions gone wrong, police cover-ups, even ritual killings. Each theory adds a new layer, but none bring us closer to the truth. For every suspect, there's a missing piece. For every clue, a contradiction. It's as if the killer made the crime too perfect, or the city too willing to look the other way. George Hodel died in 1999. He was never charged, never tried, never truly confronted. And to this day, his name casts a long shadow over the Black Dahlia case. He might have been the killer, or he might just be the most convenient villain in a story that demands one. In the end, no one was arrested. No one faced a jury. No one answered for what happened in that vacant lot on Norton Avenue. And the suspects, they vanished into history, each one wearing a different mask. 78 years have passed, yet the shadow of the Black Dahlia lingers, not just in cold case files and yellowed newspapers, but in the DNA of Los Angeles itself. Elizabeth Short has become more than a victim, more than a name. She is a myth, a symbol, a ghost that refuses to be laid to rest. In the years following her murder, the city changed. Buildings rose, freeways split neighborhoods. The glitz of Hollywood dimmed and flared again. But the story of the Dahlia never faded. It resurfaced in books, films, museum exhibits, and late-night true crime shows. Each generation discovers her like a curse passed down in whispers. Why? Because it's not just a murder story, it's a mirror. The Black Dahlia case forces us to look at the underbelly of beauty, the cost of fame, the cruelty of silence. It asks, what happens when a woman becomes an object? When the city meant to make her a star instead leaves her in pieces, countless, Writers and filmmakers have tried to answer these questions. James Ellroy's The Black Dahlia turned fiction into gritty noir. Brian De Palma's film adaptation visualized the darkness. The Root of Evil podcast, produced by Hodl's own great-granddaughters, peeled back the rod in the Hodl family tree. Steve Hodl's books insist that justice is still possible, even now, and modern forensics. They're still trying. In 2018, genetic genealogy helped identify the Golden State Killer, a case once thought unsolvable. Some believe that same technology might one day bring Elizabeth's killer to light, but it won't bring her back. The Black Dahlia became a legend, but in doing so, the real woman was almost lost. Elizabeth Short was 22 years old. She loved movies. She had asthma and bronchitis, and sometimes had to sleep propped up to breathe. She dreamed of acting, of beauty, of romance, and maybe, just maybe, of being loved. She was failed by everyone, by a system that ignored vulnerable women, by a society that judged her wardrobe more than her words, and by a justice system that couldn't or wouldn't find her killer. She deserved more than headlines. She deserved more than myth. And yet, the myth is all we have. They called her the Black Dahlia, name born from the noir films she loved, and the darkness that swallowed her. She became a symbol of beauty, cruelty, and silence, and in a city built on illusion. Her truth may be lost forever,